Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Our guest today is Bertrand Le Nézet, Chief Marketing Intelligence Officer of Viridios AI, a carbon credit pricing and data provider for the voluntary carbon market. Bertrand, I'm very pleased you could join us today. Now, today's episode is special because it's fresh after COP28, which saw much talk and discussions about carbon credits and carbon markets. So even despite the end result where countries rejected the guidelines on Article 6, I'm sure we'll still have plenty to talk about. But before that, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to join Viridios AI.
Hi, Bernard. And thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be talking on your podcast, which I'm a great fan. I'm an engineer by training. For the last 10 years, I've been working as a financial engineer, quantitative analyst for various banks. I've been working in Europe as well as in Singapore, working for European and Asian banks in general. So what happened is I liked very much what I was doing, but I wanted to sort of have more impact on the company I was working for. So I left the banks that I was working for in Singapore. I think at the back of my mind, I was always a builder. When I was even in this large corporate, I've been always venturing into space that were not initially targeted for me, such as building large in-house development team, for instance, to solve problems that the banks were stuck with. So we left with my family in Singapore, came back to Europe, and I was basically running a small consultancy practice for clients of mine and working on my own projects. That's when early 2020, that's when I was approached by Marcelo Labre, who is the CEO of Viridios AI, and Eddy Listorti, who is CEO of the groups that we created. Both of them met in New York Climate Week in 2019 and decided to create the Viridios group. And they basically, offer me a seat as a co-founder in the group. I worked with Marcelo in the real world for a couple of years in Singapore, so that's how we had a connection. And I was not hard to convince. They both were very, very knowledgeable already on carbon markets. So for instance, Marcelo did a PhD on carbon pricing at Imperial College. Eddy Listorti, who prior to carbon was a veteran banker working for very large banks. And he was already interested in carbon markets for at least 2-3 years when we started talking in 2020. So having their guidance was a great help to bootstrap my learning experience on carbon markets, and that's how we started. I discovered a fascinating space. To be honest, I was always very interested in climate change, but I never knew how my financial mathematics skills could be applied. But the more I learned about the carbon markets in general, the more I realized that a lot of my skills could be applied. Back in time, the carbon markets was in a very different place back then. And, there was, just to give an example, there was no standardized instruments like the GEO and NGO, for instance. And I realized that the market was, even more opaque, more liquid, less transparent. And this aspect of the market resonated well with some of my past experience. When I was in Singapore, I've worked on creating methodology and models to solve illiquid markets. That was for the credit markets in Asia. We're creating generic curves. In fact, with Marcelo, we even wrote a paper on that topic. And quite naturally, financial mathematics, AI skills, which were my core competencies, I could see how this topic, how this knowledge these skills could be applied very well to the voluntary carbon market. So that's really how we started.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. And can you tell us more about what it is exactly Viridios AI does? I know you've launched a pricing module for compliance carbon credits in Australia earlier this year. It would be great to learn a little bit about that, as well as whether any of this relates to Viridios Capital, if I may ask, which I know is an asset management company that is also focused on carbon projects and on the VCMs. So if you could paint us a picture of how all of this comes together.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll start with your later question. So what we created, and I alluded to that earlier, but we created not just one company, but two companies initially. So one is Viridios Capital, which is involved in capital markets activities. So we are originating projects, developing projects. We are helping companies in their decarbonization journey, advising them on their offset strategy. By and large, that's what Viridios Capital is doing. And we have created Viridios AI, which is a tech and data company. We see ourselves as a data as a service company. To sort of summarize, our intention is to build the Bloomberg of the carbon markets. Just to I think the distinction between these two companies is quite clear. And then we've recently, I'm not sure you've seen that, but we've recently acquired a third company, which is called Pangolin, which is a consulting company involved, based mostly in Australia and involved in footprinting, in assessing scope 1, 2, and 3 for companies, for corporations. So that's a group. So as you said, I'm the Chief Market and Intelligence Officer at Viridios AI. So now let's drill down a bit more into our product offering. So we started really by tackling the voluntary carbon markets. We basically we generate data set, acquire data from public sources as well as partners, and we aggregate all this to basically create actionable insights for our users. So what does this mean in practice? We will gather data from the registries, so that would be FERA, that would be gold standard. But we don't just gather the data. We aggregate it, we standardize it, we normalize it. So we've created, for instance, a project taxonomy, which allows you to compare projects from one registry to another. Otherwise, projects are always sort of, each registry would have this set of methodologies, but which are not compatible from one to another. So for us, it was very important to organize this market and create this overarching taxonomy. What we also do, unfortunately, is that we correct a number of data issues that we find in the registries. And this is because we are spending a lot of time scrutinizing the data. Then we also produce our own data set. Marcelo Labre and myself both come from financial mathematics background. So this has been what we've been doing for decades. We created a pricing methodology to aggregate market data that we get from, across the market. So from interdealer brokers, but as well as corporation giving us data, project developers giving us also data. And when I talk about data, it may be bids, offers, so market indications, or it can be actually traded price. And we've created methodology to aggregate, normalize this data. There's a lot of secret recipes, a lot of details that goes into this pricing methodology, which we create white paper to explain to our customers how these things works in very detail. We also do a lot of work around, for instance, eligibility, and that's a topic that is going to become even more relevant. So eligibility of certain projects into standardized instruments like the NGO or the GEO, but also eligibility to where we've started working on adding eligibility to Article 6, eligibility to the core carbon principle, CCB of ICVCM, and things like this. And finally, we also gather data from some of our partners, for instance, the carbon rating agencies like Silvera and B0. We also display their project rating on the platform. By and large, we also have a news module where we do a lot of work around AI classification of the news articles and relate that with carbon projects. So that's fascinating. And back to your question it is true that earlier this year, we venture into a slightly different space, which is the Australia carbon markets, so the so-called ACU. And that's quite interesting for us because it's got attributes of, in some ways, it is a bit like the voluntary carbon market because it's based on actual carbon projects disseminated throughout the Australia territory or the Australia country. So what I mean with that, it's not like a traditional compliance market like the EU ETS, where you are just trading allowance. Here you have projects and you have like an idiosyncratic aspect. It's important to understand what is a project that you're buying credits from. But then at the same time, it is from a demand standpoint, it is a compliance market. And so we've started generating price curves for different broad category of projects. And we are now embarking on building a methodology to price project or each project to price individually each project, if you want. So that has been well received. And so we're going to continue to be committed to the Australia carbon market as well.
That's fantastic. When you mentioned gathering data from partners and such, you said you've had to sometimes correct data from registries. Could you provide an example of what kind of data that is and how you exactly come to correct it?
First, I'll start by explaining that, in the registry, you have a certain number of data, which is stored in a structured fashion. And there's also a lot of unstructured data. And the unstructured data are typically 100 pages long documents, so which are going to be the project design document, or it can be a project monitoring report. So, you have a lot of information in this document, but it's not stored in a structured fashion. Examples, it can be things which are fairly easy to fix. For instance, a lot of these registries will give us, if not the shape file, at least the GPS coordinates of the project location. So many times we find forestry projects in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for instance. So that's just an example, but this is quite simple, right? When you have like the actual region, you can turn this into GPS coordinates and you can do the difference between what we get. So this is easy to clean. But, sometimes we find that the actual methodology which is registered as structured data in the registry versus what is defined in the PDD is not matching. The methodology version may be wrong. These are some of the examples.
All right, thank you. And that actually ties neatly into my next question, which is what project attributes drive prices in the VCM, since you mentioned geography and project types and so on?
So let's start with the most obvious one, which is the project type, right? So in the VCM, you've got broad category, you've got removals, you've got removal credits, you've got emission reduction or avoidance credit, if you want. So I think that distinction is already quite important. Then drilling down, we've got different. I like to call them markets because I see them operating almost as distinct markets. So we'll have on one side, we'll have the red plus market. We will have for instance, IFM, improved forest management market mostly present in the US, Canada, and Mexico, which is around improving the way we manage the forest to sort of optimize the carbon storage. Then there's also the cook stove, improved cook stove, solar cook stove market. Very different. very important in Africa, for instance. We will find finally renewables energy, so that would be solar, hydro,
wind.
Yeah, projects. Yeah, wind. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for helping on this. And then we've got gases abatement, we've got energy efficiency projects, and then, very much discussed the whole family of carbon removal projects. So I think the first and most important criteria in terms of pricing will be the type of project. But then if you drill a bit further, you'll find many other attributes which comes into picture. So, for instance, the country, we see a huge premium for certain countries or a huge discount for some countries. And that could be, just for instance, if you compare on average the price of Red Plus or forest protection projects in Latin America, if you take a look on average between Colombia and Brazil, you'll see that Brazil is, until today, still trading at a discount compared to Colombian projects. But we start seeing these changes. I think with the Lula election, Brazil is starting to trigger more trust. But until recently, it was still trading at quite a severe discount. Finally, another attribute that is very important and comes into picture for pricing is all the aspects around co-benefits. In general, listed, quantified, if you want, using the Sustainable Development Goals defined by the UN. So obviously, not all projects can deliver these SDGs. So that's more applicable typically for afforestation, reforestation projects, blue carbon, so the coastal restoration or the forest conservation projects, as well as the cook stove. But we can see that certain SDG, like good health, well-being, gender equality, quality educations, are very much in demand. And when executed well, when they've been really integrated right from the start in the project design, the local community have been engaged, we see that it translates into decent premium for these projects.
Brilliant. Now, since we've entered the last stretch of this year, looking back, do you think you could give us kind of an overview of VCM demand for all of 2023? Like, how has the market developed in the past year? What types of projects were more sought after and have perhaps gained more attention than others, and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by saying that it's obviously been a challenging year for the voluntary carbon markets, but I think it's a sign that this market is about to grow and explode. There has been a lot of scrutiny, but it is just, to me, the reflection that this market is about to explode. Obviously, with the controversy around Red Plus project and cook stove, these projects have dropped in price since January this year. But I would say that the high quality and high integrity project, and that's a good sign, in general, have kept a higher price compared to the low quality one, or the ones that were actually listed in some of these articles and were mentioned in these candles. The way I look at it is, I think the market as a whole has understood the message and has started to take action. We've seen that the registries have done a lot of work on tightening their methodology. Vera has, for instance, published a new methodology around Red Plus projects. We've seen very interesting work starting from the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the VCM, with the core carbon principles that should be published sometimes in 2024. I think that's going to be sort of a label of quality that will certainly be helpful for the investors and for the corporation, for the end users who are looking at retiring these credits. And finally, I think the work that VCMI, so more on the demand side, is also very important. We have, by defining clear code around claims. So they've published what they call the Scope 3 flexibility recently, and which is giving very a framework and very clear guidelines on to what extent what project corporation will be able to offset and into what amount without being caught in a scandal. So I think this is these are good steps. However, I think there's still many more efforts like this required in the market. So I think what's going to become very, very critical for me in the coming years is a whole discussion around digitization of the carbon markets. I think it's fair to say that we live in a very data-heavy world, and the way, let's face it, the architecture of the voluntary carbon market was until recently still too manual, too antique, and people want more data, more transparency to start trusting the carbon credits that they're buying. But then another very important thing for me is we will need to sort of fix the demand side of the market. That means, slowly moving away from a voluntary market to sort of a semi-compliance market. So there's a lot of interesting initiatives where we see fungibility in countries. For instance, Singapore, you can reduce your carbon tax by buying international credits. I think Colombia has a similar mechanism. We also have in the US, we have in the California compliance market, there's also certain projects from ACRCAR which can be used in this compliance scheme. So all these initiatives will generate demand and will make sure that people are not staying on the sideline of the market. Because what we've seen this year is, because the market was still very voluntary with a lot of the scandals that happened, a lot of the corporations sort of were almost incentivized to do nothing, meaning you were trying to reduce your carbon exposure. You were running an offset strategy and doing your due diligence on finding the right projects, and yet you could be crucified in the press because you had bought one bad project, and as a result, a lot of companies decided to temporarily stop buying carbon credits because it was actually detrimental to their brand and to their image. And so this is, to me, this is what we need to fix, right? We are considering the challenge at hand that we need to solve. We should really encourage corporations to be actively participating in this market rather than being able to stay on the sideline and say, hey, doing nothing is it's a less risky approach for me. So that cannot happen. I'm a firm believer that every company should be tackling every ton of carbon that is emitted, whether it's decarbonizing their own value chain and having a plan to abate all these emissions, or for the residual emissions, offset these emissions. And then finally, just to circle back on your initial questions, I think despite all the the controversy around the carbon markets this year, what we've seen is that the retirements, what the retirements data. So the retirements are when the end users are actually, destroying this carbon credit, so that there's no further trading with these assets, and they typically do claim on the back of that. So they are lower at the moment. They are lower than in 2022, but not that much. I think we are. I was reading yesterday. I think we are short of 15 million tons. But the year is not over. Typically, December is a month where a lot of these retirement activities are happening. And when we look at certain, I think I published something on LinkedIn recently. It's actually very interesting that we can look at the retirement registry by registry. So it is true that with all those scandals, Vera retirements have been lower. But I think if I remember correctly, for all the other main registries that we have on our platform, so which are called standard ACR and CAR, their retirements are higher in 23 than in 22. So it's not, there's some positive in this market.
Yeah, speaking of positive, I just wanted to throw in there something that we discussed with you just before the podcast. It's a very, very fresh and recent development, but an optimistic one nonetheless. As we know, the Guardian's article about the faulty carbon credits set pretty much the tone for all of 2023, and it really undermined the credibility of the voluntary carbon market. So now this article was just published that completely debunks the paper on which the Guardian based their article. And it was written by senior scientists and academics in NASA, MIT, and other universities. So with that burden off the shoulders of the VCM, do you expect people to start trusting carbon markets more now?
I think I'm welcoming this new paper that has been published. To me, it's that's just the way science works. You've got one paper, someone published another paper to contradict, and that's how we form a path, and we get better. To me, it's not just one article over the others. We will need, as I alluded to earlier, there's a couple of things that needs to be fixed in this market, be it on the infrastructure side or more on the market dynamics demand. But it's definitely very encouraging to see academics which are taking this topic seriously and uncover different lights on these RED Plus projects. Yeah.
In the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned that there was a lot of talk at COP28 about all things carbon, but carbon markets did kind of take central stage. Despite this fact, though, as you know, countries did not come to any agreement on Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, which have to do with the exchange and verification of carbon credits. How do you believe this will affect the VCMs moving forward?
I think there's a number of countries, and for instance, Singapore is one of them, which are, no matter what, based on what was previously agreed in Glasgow, are already moving on and progressing and doing Article 6 transactions. This is not going to stop these pioneers. I think countries which would be less pioneers would probably would feel more at ease with a sort of a more clear path and a stricter framework. But I think nonetheless, there will be countries progressing on these topics, even with a lack of, clear guidelines. I think there will be. I really hope that before COP, we manage to get some clarity, some more clarity on Article 6, because this is a topic that is coming over and over again in our conversation with customers. There's a high demand for sort of Article 6 eligible projects. So yeah, we didn't get the agreement and the announcement we were expecting. Having said that, nonetheless, there were quite a number of of very interesting announcement and agreement made during COP28. So there was an announcement on a collaboration between registries to sort of form common principles on accounting for avoidance and removal credits. I think Singapore, very interesting, introduced this concept of transition credits to sort of encourage the coal power station to sort of phase down the coal power station in Asia. There's mixed results, but I believe the market will nonetheless, the voluntary carbon market will nonetheless continue to grow in 24. So.
I'm hopeful for that as well. And a final question for me before we wrap up. What's in the pipeline for Viridios AI? Is there something that you can share with us?
Yeah, so we are working on numerous things. I mentioned that earlier. We are finalizing a methodology, a pricing methodology for pricing at the project level for the Australia markets. We are also, that's going to be very exciting. We're going to launch a new set of dashboards on our platform, like a full-fledged analytics module with self-service business intelligence, so that people can customize their own reports. And that will really, because I think our platform has a lot of interesting data, mostly displayed project by project. So it's going to be an easy way for people to aggregate things, compare how is the price, or how is the price for this project comparing to a broader family, to a broader, to similar project in the region, things like this. So these are some of the two main projects which are keeping us busy. So that's what's coming up immediately in 24.
Excellent. I wish you all the best with that, Bertrand. And this was such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing so much about what you do and shining a light on the state of the VCM at the moment. I really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Thank you very much, Violet, for the platform. It was a pleasure talking to you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.